C.3, Basic Rules of CSS. So in this part, first, let us look at the typical way we write a CSS rule. CSS syntax. All right. First, let me use this example to show you the basic elements when we define a CSS rule. All right. So here, the whole thing here, we call a CSS rule. The whole thing. CSS rule. All right. In a previous video at one place, probably I used the rule in a wrong way. Here, let me correct it. I remember at one place I said style, right? Style attribute. Style equal double quotes. Then inside it, we can provide rule 1, semicolon, rule 2, semicolon, right? In that place, we should use property 1, semicolon. Property 2, semicolon. Right? It's not a rule, because the whole thing inside the double quotes, it contains multiple properties. That whole thing we call the one rule. The whole thing we call the one rule. So that's the difference, rule and a property. Rule and a property. Here, this whole thing we call the one rule. Then here you can see property. Property 1, property 2. So that's the, how do we call, the terminology here. Let me explain the basic elements in this example here. First, a CSS rule set. CSS rule set. That's we call a rule set. Consists of a selector, and a declaration block. A pair of curly braces. The whole thing, curly braces, inside that pair of curly braces, declaration block. Selector, what's the selector? So let's look at a selector. The selector points to the HTML element you want to style. Think about the typical situation in the HTML document. So we have many elements, right? So when we want to apply one specific CSS rule, usually we do not apply it on all the elements, right? You have to select certain number of elements. So you need to make the selection. So the selector, that part, helps you to do the selection. All right. The declaration block contains one or more declarations separated by semicolon. So declaration 1, declaration 2, separated by semicolon. You can do declaration 3, 4, 5, any number of declarations you want to put there. Then declaration, here we call one declaration, we can also call one property. So many people also, they like to call property 1, property 2, property 3. All right, so next, each declaration includes a CSS property name and a value. Here, one property, it has two parts, property name and a property value. So property name part and the value part. Here you see name value pair, right? But the property name, use colon to separate. Name, colon, value, separated by a colon. Value. So you get a name, value pair. Name, value pair. Combined together, so that's one property. One property. All right? Then semicolon, you go to the next property. In this way. All right. Declaration blocks are surrounded by curly braces. All right, let's look at example. In this simple example, look at the way we write it. First, selector. This P corresponds to P tag. Paragraph, we know that, right? P tag. Okay, so you may have some content, inside content, closing P tag. All right, like this. Now, you define the whole rule in this way. Two properties, color property, property name color, value red, semicolon. Next property, the name, text, dash, align, colon, its value center. Center alignment. Okay, yeah. So that's the style rule definition. Then you selector here, because your selector you use the tag name P. That means this rule is applied to all P tags. If you have 100 P tags in this document, this rule will be applied to all the 100 P tags. Okay, if you use the tag name. Okay, so that is the first way selector. We have second, third, we have multiple different way selector. Yeah. In the next two slides, we will look at all the possibilities for the selector. Yeah. All right. Next one, CSS comments. Yeah. Sometimes you may like to put a few lines, comments, for the programmers. So you want to understand this, some special way to use the style rules. You may need that, right? Yeah. So we use the C style, right? So this is the C style comment. Yeah. Okay. And you can do in multiple lines, one line way and a multiple line way. Yeah. All right. Next, selectors, part 1. Yeah. Part 1. Yeah. CS selectors are used to find or select the HTML elements you want to style, but how, right? Here, we will learn certain number of ways. Number 1, number 2, number 3. The first way we saw in the previous example, the element selector. Specify the element. P tag, P element, right? Yeah. So the element selector selects HTML elements based on the element name. Yeah, so that example, yeah. But if you use this way, you apply this rule on all the elements with this name. With this name. So think about that. Yeah. But later you have way to reduce the, the element coverage. You have chance. You have, other ways to narrow down. So I don't want to apply on all the P elements. I only want to apply this particular rule on certain special number of P elements. Then I need to narrow down, using some other parts in the selector to narrow down. Yeah, it's possible. Yeah, we will see later. Yeah, the second type selector, CSS ID selector. ID, yeah, ID selector. ID. Because we know each element we can define ID attribute. We use ID attribute. for each element. We add ID attribute. ID equal a string, double quotes, a string inside. We define ID for one element. Then this ID can be used as selector in our CSS rule definition. The ID selector uses the ID attribute of an HTML element to select a specific element. This one, because ID, we know ID must be unique, right? ID must be unique. So when you use this way, you only select one particular element. All right. So the ID of element is unique within a page, whole document. One ID, one specific value of ID can only be used in one element. Otherwise, you will have some problem. So this uniqueness requirement for ID attribute. All right. So that ID selector is used to select one unique element. So that's the second way for the selector. To select an element with a specific ID, write a hash character followed by the ID of the element. That's the way to write the selector, hash character. Look at the example. Here, this is the selector part. Hash, then paragraph 1, para 1. All right. So then we should apply the rule here on ID element, the element with ID value para 1. Para 1. The hash character tells the browser we want to select an element with this ID value. All right, so here, this is the element with ID value. So the rule is applied onto this element. That simple. Okay, all right. Note, an ID name cannot start with a number. 2, 3, 5, you cannot start with that. Right? It must be alphabet character. Okay? All right. Next, CSS selectors part 2. The CSS class selector. Our third type, class selector. So what's that? The class selector selects HTML elements with a specific class attribute. So this time we need to use class. That's the attribute name, class attribute name, but we can define the same class attribute value on multiple HTML elements. Not unique, because ID will require unique, right? Class, we do not require unique. Because sometimes we want to apply one rule on multiple elements. So this class way helps us to do that. So let's look at the more specifics. To select elements with a specific class, write a period character. Replace hash character to period character. Then we get the class way. Followed by the class name. Look at this example. Here we want to define a rule for class called center class. So how do you target elements with center class dot center, period, center. In this way, this whole rule will be applied to all the elements with the same center class name, class value, same center class value. Yeah. Name is class, value is center for those elements. Now, let's look at it. Element in this way. Class attribute name and center attribute value. Now, if an element has this kind of class, then this rule can be applied on this element. You may have multiple elements with the same class value, and this rule will be applied to all those elements. Yeah. All right. Yeah. You can also specify that only specific HTML elements should be affected by a class. Yeah. Here, we can, when we define a selector, we can combine, some of the types we just discussed. Yeah. So let's look at one example here. Yeah. P dot center. So look at this selector, P dot center. What's the meaning of that? First, it must be applied to P element. But not all P elements. Not all P. Only those P elements with center class value. Center class. So you can see we narrow down. We use dot center to narrow down to elements, to those P elements with this class name center. Yeah. So that's the way. Yeah. All right. And another way, yeah. HTML elements can also refer to more than one class. So what do we mean? Yeah. Here, so let's look at for one particular element, when we apply CSS rules, we use the class way, right? When you use the class way, you can use more than one classes. Class 1, class 2, class 3, and so on. Yeah. So let's look at a simple example here. Yeah. In this example, yeah, we apply two rules. Rule 1, center rule. Rule 2, large rule. Yeah, we can define large. Yeah. How to define the large? So, that's not important. Okay. So think about, so somewhere we write a large rule. Dot, curly braces, property 1, property 2, property 3. Close curly braces. All right. Yeah. Then here, look at how do we apply those two different rules on the same element. All right. Class equal double quotes. Yeah. Class 1. Yeah. Class 1 and space. Yeah. Use space to separate. You have to put a space between two different classes. Then class 2. Yeah. If we have 3, another space, class 3, and so on. Yeah. Note, class name cannot start with a number. Yeah. Similar to the ID value, you cannot start with a number. Yeah. All right, so that's our video C.3. Yeah.